Greetings, Tuberistas. I say I lost a subscriber after my last video on Dixie Chicks and Pussy Riot. Either it really sucked or wasn't what my usual viewers have come to expect, but it is what it is, and brings me to the larger topic of human rights. In the past couple decades, we've seen the Western world embrace this as official state ideology. In essence, there's nothing new about it. The rights of man, the Bill of Rights, all these, in their modern form, derive from the Enlightenment and the political movements of liberty, equality, and fraternity that are embodied in the concept of democracy, or the modern interpretation of the ancient Greek idea. What we've seen, though, is a reinterpretation of that concept that separates the individual and his or her rights from the social context in which the individual exists. It's apparently beyond the ability of our human rights advocates to see that social democracy is inseparable from political democracy, that individuals can enjoy rights not only if the state respects them, but the society underpinning that state can give them meaning. In Latin America, for instance, there has been little political democracy precisely because of its entrenched feudalism of rule by landed oligarchs, financial parasites, foreign corporations, and the military enforcers, which has erected over the generations a yawning, unbridgeable chasm between classes and races, certainly too vast for the paper bridge of electoral democracy alone. The very kind of abyss that neoliberalism seeks to erect globally and uses rights-based rhetoric to defend. This is a logical contradiction to the point of insanity, but the spin indoctrinators of Western think tanks, have continued their time-honored tradition of making angels dance on the heads of pins. The right to education, for instance, is considered a founding pillar of democracy. As such, it transcends privilege and fate, the privilege of those at the top to get it all, the fate of those at the bottom to take shit. The idea of universal education as a human right is revolutionary because it destroys the basis of social inequity. In societies like Peru or South Africa, where first world affluence lives cheek to cheek with third world destitution, political democracy is a hollow mockery without its social component. Democracy must therefore become revolutionary, must become social, to realize even its most basic principles. I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. That a narrowed focus on individual rights alone serves those who take their social rights for granted. As such, it becomes another first world privilege to be forced on the third world in its festering destitution. Thus, we see the U.S. war in Indochina retroactively justified because it could have stopped the Khmer Rouge from committing genocide. But left unanswered is how dropping millions of explosive tonnage on a country and its people can uphold their right to live free of genocide. We see elsewhere how human rights rhetoric has been used for violent intervention. The coalition of the willing bombed Iraq through deception to bring the rule of law so its people could live in truth, to use Václav Havel's famous phrase. Afghanistan is being bombed to liberate girls and women from patriarchal violence. Unilateral drone assassinations are conducted in Yemen and Pakistan to promote secular democracy and freedom from fanaticism and terror. And so it goes. And groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch actively promote this dual standard without batting an eye. Human rights has been carefully recrafted as a servant of corporate and military power, while the social basis that can give it meaning and context is defined out of existence. And not only for backward third worlders. In the first, we're told that even the right to education, to health, to eat are not human rights because they're not rooted in the individual's freedom from state control, because these social rights depend so largely on state intervention. They're the opposite of human rights, which consist mainly in individuals legally voting, speaking, writing, assembling, as long as they don't demand anything of other legally sovereign individuals. Not being rights, they're privileges, be taken away or granted as other privileges, like the right to drive. The concrete who's and whom's are obliterated by abstraction in order to make their realization impossible for the majority of living individuals. And when projecting the best of motives to Western democratic rights violations, or to the friends, allies, and useful tools of Western power, the violation of rights by enemy regimes must be catalogued in sordid detail as evidence for future tribunals. Thus, Pol Pot is harangued as a criminal of the Indochina Wars, but not Henry Kissinger, who masterminded the initial destruction of Cambodia that made Pol Pot possible. The Khmer Rouge are indicted as genocidal maniacs, but not the U.S. Defense Department, which endorsed the body count concept as a kill quota for anything with slanted eyes that moved in designated kill zones. We see a comparable hypocrisy in designating victims of human rights violation as worthy or unworthy victims. Worthy victims are those suffering violations under enemy regimes like Socialist Cuba. But under friendly regimes like Capitalist Cuba, under Fulgencio Batista, well, at least he was our son of a bitch, so all was peachy keen. Confirmation again of Graham Greene's old classification of the torturable and the non-torturable. Worthy, untorturable victims are those suffering persecution and oppression in Iran or North Korea or Syria. But in Pakistan, Indonesia, or Turkey, they have it coming. Again, the example of Cuba illustrates the one-dimensionality of human rights rhetoric emanating from the West. It never occurs to the human rights peddlers that Fidel Castro's Cuba is a dissident regime in its own right, whose right to dissent and disagree has been totally denied by an omnipotent United States that will brook no dissent from its hegemony in its hemisphere. The U.S. has and continues to be as hegemonic in the Western Hemisphere as it accuses Fidel Castro of being in Cuba. If Castro jails his dissidents, the U.S. in turn embargoes the entire country. If Cuba denies its people the human right to emigrate, the U.S. in turn denies its citizens the right to travel to Cuba, even as tourists. Cuba enacted repressive measures against its internal counter-revolution, but during the same era, the freedom-loving U.S. of A. endorsed terror and torture states from the Isthmus of Panama to the Southern Cone to stop the spread of Castroite subversion. Said subversion encompassing social democracies like Allende's Chile or Jesuits in El Salvador. Sometimes, though, the demonization gets reversed, as witness Hugo Chavez, who nicely turned the tables on the U.S. for a change at the United Nations. And on it goes, up to the relatively minor fiascos of girl bands at war with the state. Uh-oh, I knew it was about time. Hello, Milton Friedman? Again? What does Uncle Milty have to say about human rights? That there's no such thing as a free lunch. Therefore, one should pay for the privilege of eating, because eating is not an inherent right. Despite what your craving biology tells your body, it has no inherent right to nutrients unless some middleman has been appeased and profited thereby. But your right to say this is an immutable human right to be defended by napalm and cluster bombs and drone assassination. That's democracy. Not eating, not being educated enough to read your words, not being healthy enough to live as long as you. That's what Iraqis and Afghans and Pakistanis and Yemenis have to get droned into them.